We turn finally this morning to politician Austin Currie, who died this past week at the age of 82, a titan of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland.
Well, I think probably historians will pay a lot of attention to the civil rights campaign. It's the most significant thing which has happened in Irish politics since 1916.
He was a former nationalist MP in the Old Stormont for East Tyrone, a founder member of the SDLP, helped negotiate the Sunningdale Agreement and was Minister for Housing, Local Government and Planning in that short-lived power-sharing Northern Ireland executive which followed the agreement. He was later a Fine Gael TD for West Dublin and was Minister of State in the Rainbow Government from 1989 to 2002 and was Fine Gael candidate for the presidency of Ireland in 1990. As you can well imagine, the RTE Sound Archives handsomely cover his lengthy career, but we concentrate this morning on his beginnings as a politician in the civil rights movement in the late 1960s. He's speaking here first about his boyhood in Tyrone to Miriam O'Callaghan.
Well, between Coal Island and Dungannon, a place called Edendork, my father and mother at the end of the war, they bought a house and 8 acres of land for £450. And that's where we moved in 1946. I turned out to be the eldest of 11, of 8 boys and 3 girls. And my father drove a lorry. I suppose we can say we were poor, but then everyone was poor at the time, and we were no different from our neighbours.
His first political awakening, he recalled, was on the partition question.
At that time, the anti-partition movement was being formed, and a new GA pitch was being opened in Coal Island, and a number of southern politicians were invited to it. And I listened with great interest to the speeches on that occasion. And the following day, anyone in the vicinity of Mullaghmarket would have seen this strange spectacle of a number of boys, 4 or 5, with buckets, which they pretended were drums. And this flag was planted, and the eldest of the boys then got up and made a speech in which the recurring feature was, "Border must go, the border must go."
Like others of his generation, he benefited from scholarships and was educated at Queen's University, Belfast. He became Nationalist MP for East Tyrone in the Old Stormont.
My memory of Austin Currie, who was our Member of Parliament in East Tyrone.
40 years later, Bernadette Devlin recalled her local MP.
Was that he was seen as the new, powerful, radical, broader voice of nationalism.
Discrimination in housing allocation was one of the central grievances of nationalists of Catholics. Voting in local elections was confined to ratepayers, so discrimination in housing suppressed the nationalist vote.
We heard through the priest that him and the councillor in Caledon had got together and were having 15 houses built.
This was a celebrated case of housing discrimination. The Goodfellows were a Catholic family expecting to be housed in Caledon.
And this was sort of a gentleman's agreement, which would be 7 of these for Catholics and 8 for Protestants. When it came to the houses being allocated, they allocated 14 of them to Protestants and 1 to a Catholic.
What happened then?
Well, when we heard who they'd been set to, another family called McKenna and ourselves decided we'd squat into them and bring it to the notice of the public what happened.
So you squatted?
So we squatted in October 1967, and on the 18th of June the bailiffs and under-sheriff and police and all arrived to evict us out of the house. And they put myself, my husband and 3 young children out on the roadside and set the house next door to a 19-year-old unmarried girl.
This unmarried woman was 19, single and secretary to a local unionist councillor. Austin Currie was Nationalist MP at Stormont for the constituency and recognised just how transparently blatant an example this was of unionist discrimination. He decided on direct action and illegally squatted in the house to draw public attention to the case.
Well, this particular case of injustice stood on its own, but I made it clear throughout my campaign that I was fighting not only against this unjust allocation, but against the whole system of housing allocation. And of course, I had wider motives. I had been at that time in Stormont for almost 4 years. Discrimination and injustice in Northern Ireland had been my main concentration. And I had high hopes that Terence O'Neill would deliver the reforms. But I had come to the conclusion that was unlikely to happen. There was an increasing disillusionment and anger with Terence O'Neill, and I had come to the conclusion that no reform would be expected from O'Neill, and therefore what we ought to be doing was to be concentrating on the British government to put pressure on the Stormont government. And so part of the exercise at Caledon was to get publicity, and it was very successful in that. And having achieved that, I and my closest colleagues, John Donaghy and Michael McLaughlin, then went on to propose the first civil rights march between Coalisland and Dungannon. We were thinking in terms of the civil rights marches in the United States, but again the purpose was to put pressure on the British government in order to put pressure on the Unionist regime.
Then came the 5th of October 1968, the Civil Rights March in Derry, where the civil rights marchers were stopped by the RUC.
Any person who wishes to parade or hold a meeting is quite at liberty to do so, provided he holds it other than in an area specified in the order made by the Minister.
We are the people of Derry and we intend marching in our city.
And Austin Currie, when you went on protests like this protest, and you were on many protests like this protest, was there an expectation that you were going to be beaten up by the state apparatus or by freelance elements?
Austin Currie, 40 years after that central event with Miles Duncan.
Were you ready for that? Were you prepared for that? Was it almost inevitable?
No, it wasn't inevitable. But I did realise that there would be confrontations. And to some extent, we relied on the confrontation because, after all, the main exercise, the main thing in which we were engaged was to publicise the conditions in Northern Ireland. And on the 5th of October in Derry, we must pay a tribute to two people for contributing to that. One was Bill Craig, the Minister for Home Affairs, in banning the march in the first place, and therefore added greatly to the publicity and also to the attendance, even though it was relatively small. And secondly, of course, to Gay O'Brien for his film, which went around the world and did what we had hoped would happen. Now, in Dungannon, we had invited the international press to be in attendance, but unfortunately the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia 3 days in advance. Waiting for this programme to come on, I noted the irony of the previous item of the Russians invading Georgia.
Plus
we had a similar situation. We had a similar situation where they invaded Czechoslovakia 40 years ago, and of course we didn't get as much publicity because the International Press Corps went to Prague. But on this occasion in Derry, there were sufficient present for the thing to go around the world. And the brutal way in which the RUC responded, there had been other marches in the past. I'm thinking of Newton Butler way back in 49. I'm thinking of Pomeroy in 1953-54. There were other marches where the RUC was equally as brutal, but the press weren't there, and Gay O'Brien wasn't there with his camera, and that's what made the difference. And that's what I had been hoping for from the very beginning.
The late Austin Currie, who died this week, aged 82. We move finally this morning to Austin Currie, who has died aged 82. Last Sunday we marked his northern political career as a civil rights activist and one of the founders of the SDLP. He was also a minister in the short-lived power-sharing executive post-Sunningdale.
When one looks back now and compares the deal that we had at Sunningdale in 1973 with the Good Friday Agreement, and you ask yourself the question, over 2,000 people lost their lives in that interval. They lost their lives for what?
People who opted, though, for the violent path would say, look, the British government didn't stand up to the Ulster workers' strike. They were allowed to pull down that power-sharing executive. And frankly, Sunningdale didn't have the two extremes, loyalists and Republicans. And without that, you were never going to get a Good Friday Agreement.
Well, the Good Friday Agreement wouldn't have been necessary if, ask yourself the question, if, and okay, I take the criticism about the British government, but if Sunningdale had lasted, if we had been allowed to get on with what we were trying to do, the situation would have changed. We would have found confidence in each other. And for those from the Republican tradition who say that the violence was necessary, they played their part in bringing down Sunningdale. It just wasn't the loyalists. It just wasn't the weak-kneed British government. The IRA escalated their campaign after Sunningdale, and they started letting off bombs in places where they never had gone off before. Places like Bangor in County Down, places which had been quite quiet. And this is where Brian Faulkner lost out, because Brian Faulkner had said, this is the sacrifice that unionists are making to bring about this power-shared executive, that we will have peace. It didn't have peace. In fact, the IRA escalated the campaign. So those who use the argument you have suggested there are entirely wrong.
This morning, his second political career south of the border. It began in the post-Garret Fitzgerald era in the 1989 general election, when Fine Gael was led by Alan Dukes, but the invitation to stand came from Garret Fitzgerald.
And he said, Austin, how would you like to fight a safe seat for Fine Gael? And I said, Garret, I know enough to know there's no such a thing as a safe seat. And I told him I'd think about it. I discussed it with my wife and children. I eventually said yes, and I was put in touch with Alan Dukes and Jim Mitchell, and
you got the seat.
I got the seat.
Now, it was a year later when you got catapulted into the presidential election. Does that all seem like a bad dream now?
Mm-hmm. Catapulted is a very nice word. It was a disaster, really. I shouldn't have allowed myself to have been talked into it. A lot of people were give me advice in favour, but some, and one in particular in my constituency, sort of said to me, Austin, you've been here for only a year. You've been doing very well. There'll be some people saying, who does that fellow think he is, that he's going to go for the highest position in the state with a year's experience of Southern politics? And they were right. It certainly didn't do me any good as far as my political career is concerned, because in politics, well, nobody likes a loser, even if you consider yourself to be a gallant loser.
And that interview with Miriam O'Callaghan was on the occasion of Austin Currie's 75th birthday. It concluded with this brief exchange.
Final question. You're a northerner. People often say, and you live down here now, do you think we're very different creatures in the south to you from the north?
No, I don't. Currie, are they different from the rest of the country? Of course they are. I'm very fond of Mayo. They're different from a lot of people elsewhere. In Tyrone we certainly are. But we have far, far more in common on the island and north and south than we have with anyone else. Spend a while in Britain and you'll find out.
Austin Currie from the Archives.